Today we're going to be exploring 11 fun, different watercolor techniques that are really important to know either just because they're basic skills within watercolor, or some of them can make really fun backgrounds and just give you really interesting textures. But we're going to do it in a way where we don't just have to sit down and practice, because even though practice is really important, I get it. Sometimes it's not very fun just to sit down and practice. We're actually going to make something intentional with them so we have a little more motivation to actually try them out. If you like to celebrate Valentine's Day, these would make really cute Valentines. If you're not into it, these could be great little cards to write self-care notes on, or even just any time of the year. I mean, I would love to receive a card like this on my birthday, or just because. And if you don't feel like making cards, you don't have to make these into cards. You could just grab your paper to practice, or maybe make little name cards with. Do something that's going to be fun for you. If you do want to make the cards, you're going to need some watercolor paper, and you could either fold them over to make the card shape. I tend to like these cards from Strathmore that are not shaped like this. They're shaped like normal cards, and they come in these packs, and they're just 140-pound watercolor paper, so you can actually make these. But I like that they come pre-scored, and they also come with envelopes, so it just makes things a little bit easier for me, and that's why I use these. But you could use whatever paper works for you. If you want to follow along with every single one of these, in addition to the normal watercolor supplies, I do also use masking fluid, salt, and rubbing alcohol to create some interesting effects. So let's dive into the first technique. Actually, before we get started with that, I need to explain how I'm going to make each of these cards, because the real star of the show is going to be the technique we're applying to it, but I think that the shape of the card can add a little extra pizzazz, so I want each of mine to be heart-shaped. And I'm going to do this by grabbing one of my cards, folding it in half, and then I want to make sure that I keep a section of that folded edge so that when we open these up, they don't just fall apart. And I'm going to trace the largest heart shape that I possibly can while also staying within the confines and keeping that edge intact. Now, when it comes to actually applying each technique, I'm going to paint on these as they are with the outline on them. This will enable me to paint over the edges so that it goes across the entire heart, and I don't have to kind of try to paint across a very odd shaped thing. And then finally, once the paint is dry, I will cut these out, and I think they look so cute. For our first technique, I want to start with the basics, and the most basic one, in my opinion, is wet on dry. Now, in case you're brand new to watercolor, what does that mean? It literally means that you're going to take your wet paint, because watercolor paint has to be wet in order to really use it, and then you're going to apply that wet paint to dry paper. Now, the areas you apply the wet paint to will obviously become wet because it's wet paint, but the areas in between are going to stay dry. And what this means for your painting is that the strokes you place down and the shapes that you paint are going to stay exactly where you put them. The colors within the strokes or shapes you made might change a bit as things kind of settle in, but where you place them will stay consistent. And you're going to be able to see the paper in between areas of paint and not paint. Things are not going to flow together here. And this technique is great for adding in details or making fun patterns that you want to stay separate. Next up, we're going to talk about wet on wet. It's perfect to come after wet on dry so that you can see a direct comparison between putting the wet paint on dry paper and putting the wet paint on wet paper in this case. When I'm wetting a larger area, I typically like to move over to a bigger brush. You can do this with a smaller brush. It just takes a little bit longer, and I find this a bit easier. So I'm going to wet the entire thing. Keep in mind when you're wetting this, the wetter it is, the less control you're going to have over how the colors are going to flow together. So if you want a lot of interactions, you're almost going to want puddles of water on the page. If you want them to just move a little bit, you just want it to be damp. On this card, I tried to more or less keep a lot of the same shapes and colors where I placed them on the wet on dry, so that you can more clearly see the difference between the results of wet on wet and wet on dry. Notice as I place these down on the wet paper, they start to spread. They start to kind of interact with each other in some cases. Your results are really going to vary here because your paints might behave differently than the paints I'm using. And if you worked really wet on this one, you're also going to notice that as it dries, these colors are going to lighten because there was more water in them, and they're also going to move and bleed a bit more as they dry. I love this technique because it creates these really unpredictable reactions, and it just has beautiful movement in it without trying. But it can be kind of frustrating because you lose a lot of the control the wetter you work. But the wetter you work, the more incredible the reactions you can get. For number 3, we're going to tackle dry brushing, which is
almost the exact opposite of wet on wet. We're going to be doing this on dry paper. Then we're going to fill our brush with a color. And notice that when we first fill it with the color, it just kind of glides across the paper, and everywhere that you place the bristles, there's a smoothness to the color distribution. But if we are to take this brush, tap it so it's dry, you can do this in increments. Notice that I'm going to tap it more and more here, and then I'm going to be lightly applying pressure on this page, just letting the bristles kind of slide across the page without really any pressure. And notice that there is some areas where you can see the paper through. It does not create a solid line where the bristles contact the paper. The drier the brush is, the more of those little spots you're going to get. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to fill my brush with a color, dry it off, and then I'm just going to pull it down the page in these vertical stripes. And that's dry brushing. I want to give this one a little more pizzazz though, so I am going to do this with another color, but using horizontal stripes. And this is already pretty dry on the page, so I probably don't need to do this, but I am going to dry it really quick just to make sure that everything stays nice and separated so that we can really focus on what this technique does, because I think it's such a lovely technique, and dry brushing is really kind of underrated. This can be used for, in this case I wanted to kind of mimic a fabric type effect, but it's also wonderful in landscapes for creating things like gravel roads, or if you're trying to add some texture to water, or maybe you're just trying to make things look a little antique-y. You will have to play around with the different brushes you have, how dry they are, and then how much pressure you're applying to get the hang of it. But once you do, this one can just add so much extra life in such a simple manner. For number 4, I want to go a little more left field, and this is actually taking some rubbing alcohol. I have this craft rubbing alcohol, but normal rubbing alcohol will work for this too. I've got my rubbing alcohol and then a little pipette, and we're going to be using the rubbing alcohol to create interesting reactions. But first, what we need to do is actually apply down some pretty wet colors. Whatever colors you want, just make sure that they stay nice and wet as you're applying across the entire card shape or wherever you're practicing. Then you can take your pipette or however you're going to drop this on here, and you just apply these drops directly onto the wet paper, and it creates these really interesting double ringed circles that are really defined while letting some of the watercolor magic peek in between them. And this technique would be great for just fun abstract play, or if you wanted to add in a really interesting background. This could also be really pretty for kind of like snowfall with those really big falls, or even an eclipse type thing. There's a lot of different applications for something like this, but more than likely you'd use this in abstracts or as a background. Number 5 might be one of my personal favorite watercolor techniques, and that is blooms. This is a very similar technique to the rubbing alcohol technique. However, it has very different results. We're going to start the same way, where we're going to apply down whatever colors we want. I recommend using darker colors for this just so you can really see what's happening while you're experimenting with this, but place them down so that the entire page stays nice and wet. Then we're going to wash our brush and we're going to refill it with water. And then we're just going to directly drop this right on, just like we did with the rubbing alcohol. And you're going to notice a couple things here, because the same thing happens where all that color kind of gets pushed away, but it is much more subtle to start. And that's actually one of the tricky things with blooms, is you don't want to put too many because they grow a ton. The rubbing alcohol ones, it's pretty immediate. You can see where they're going to be and where they're going to stop. But these, watch as I speed this up as it dries. Look how much these grow over a minute or two. They started off and they were barely perceptible, and now they're really starting to spread. The unique thing about these blooms is they are going to differ depending on what colors you're using, because different colors are going to have different properties. But in general, they create these really interesting natural shapes that are kind of spindly. They remind me of a creature or a bush, and I love them so much. As a matter of fact, I really like using these for things like adding texture to bushes or trees, or sometimes I'll do this in the foreground of a grassy area. And by just dropping a little water into my wash for the foreground of greens and yellows, it makes its own bushes and I don't have to paint anything. Number 6 is also one of my favorites, and that is charging. So charging in essence is kind of like wet and wet, but instead of the whole paper just being clear water wet, What we're doing is we're going to make the paper wet with a color. You could do this in a whole area, or I'm just going to do it in these little strips. But I put my initial color down and the paper is still wet, and then I'm going to be refilling my brush with other colors and charging it in to those initial wet colors. And the beauty of charging is that it's a way to mix colors directly on the paper. Notice that in some of these you can tell there's yellow in my brush, but when I place it in the pink or if I put it into the blue or something, the color changes. It's now orange or it's going to be green. And so you can actually mix colors directly in while also getting really interesting wet on wet type reactions, because in essence you are doing wet on wet, just using colors instead of just water. I love using this technique. It's one of my favorites because, well, I really like a lot of these techniques, but I love using these to just create some really interesting variation, because the beauty of watercolor is these reactions here. It's something that's really unique to this medium, and so when I'm painting things, if I can charge other colors into other ones, it's beautiful, but it can kind of create little gradient effects on the edges of things. It's also a really good way to add a shadow to something. This technique is both just for fun looks, but it can also be used in really practical applications. Next up, you're going to need to grab a spray bottle and we're going to spritz our paper. We want to make sure that there's a pretty good concentration of water, but you want little areas in between the bigger droplets that are going to kind of connect and also leave a little paper that is dry. And in my example, I probably could have used a little more water on the page, but notice how when I fill up my brush now with color and then I touch it to those big wet spots, it starts to kind of seep into all those little spritzed areas. And there's something really fun about watching this reaction happen. You could literally just do this as an activity for fun, but practical applications of this technique would be for backgrounds, or if you wanted to paint something that was kind of out of focus, you'd want to use the colors that are in your painting, but something like this in the background where the colors are where you want them to be for the subjects that are out of focus in the distance, this would be great. For number 8, you need to get ready to be messy because we're going to be adding some splatter to this one. You can do splatter in a ton of different ways, but most commonly what you're going to do is fill up a brush with a bunch of color and water, and then you just flick it at the page. I typically like to use my left hand to put my finger out so I have something to kind of tap it against so that it actually creates that release point where the paint actually splatters out of the bristles. And if you're going to play with this one, I really recommend trying out a couple different brushes because each of them is going to have different effects. The way that the droplets are going to come out are going to be bigger or smaller. And then some of these ones where they have kind of shorter or more rigid bristles are great for kind of grabbing them and flicking, and that will create a more fine mist. This technique can be used to just add a little extra interest. Sometimes this is even used as a finishing touch on a painting just to give it a little more life and a little more of that watercolor feel. Please keep in mind that when you're doing this, you want to make sure there's nothing around you that you're going to be heartbroken if a bunch of paint splatters gets on, because this can really go everywhere. For number 9, you're going to need to go to your kitchen and grab a little bit of salt. If you want to get extra fancy with this and you have multiple types of salt, you can grab some different grains because each type of salt is going to have different reactions. Finer salt will have a different reaction than the big flaky salt or the sea salt. So maybe if you have a couple, grab a couple. For this technique to work really well, you want to use some darker colors so that you can really see the reactions, at least initially. You could definitely use lighter colors on this, but it's just going to be more interesting while you're practicing with the darker colors. And then work fairly wet. Make sure your salt is ready to go because you want to apply this when things are still really wet, and just sprinkle it on. Right away, you can see that those pigment particles become attracted to the actual pieces of salt and they clump around there. And that already creates a really interesting effect, but what happens after it dries is where it gets really interesting because it creates kind of these little blooms and things. And then also when you go to remove it, you have those clusters where that pigment is kind of settled right around. So you get a ton of really good variation. I do want you to keep in mind when you're doing this, in order to remove the salt, you want to make sure everything is fully dry or you're just going to be smudging it around. And to remove it, you can just kind of use your fingers or a soft cloth to take it off. Please keep in mind that some of the salt will remain, so the paper is going to feel gritty and it's going to be hard to paint on top of this. So typically this is used as more of a finishing touch. I like to use salt to add a natural texture to things. I've used it on my whales before because I think it creates kind of an interesting, almost underwater sunlight effect on things. Or if I'm trying to add in maybe a whole group of rocks on the ground, this can also be really fun. Just put a whole bunch of different colors of the rocks and then drop the salt in and let it do its own thing. Next up, we're playing with masking fluid, and I do want to, before we do this, make sure I take a second. If you have a latex allergy, please check your masking fluid because most masking fluid is liquid latex. There are a few options that are latex free, but I want to mention that just in case this technique looks interesting and you do have a latex allergy. When I'm looking for masking fluid, most masking fluids work more or less the same, but I usually look for one that has a fine tip applicator, and as you can see here, the one that I'm demonstrating with ran out. I thought I had more in there, but it's gone. It's been my favorite for a while. Thankfully, I have this other one I want to test that has one of those fine tip applicators, so I'm just going to switch over to it. And I'm going to just make a bunch of different hearts on my heart. The premise behind masking fluid is that you're going to be placing this on the paper, you let it dry, you can paint directly on top of it, and then when you remove it, it reveals the white paper underneath it. When you apply it, you do need to make sure that it dries before you try to paint on top of it because you don't want this stuff in your brushes, and you also don't want to force this dry. I know that I like to use a heat gun for a lot of things, but don't use it for masking fluid. This is one of those things you just need to set to the side and let dry on its own. And most masking fluids, you're going to notice when you apply them, they look a little bit milkier, and then as they dry, they change color and they get a bit more clear. So there is a pretty good indication when it's ready for you to paint on. And once it is ready to paint on, you can paint just directly over it. You don't have to be careful at all. And that's the real beauty of masking fluid, is that if there's an area you want to make sure stays white, and you're worried that you're going to start kind of getting your brush strokes a little bit too close to it, just put a little masking fluid on it. Masking fluid is often used for just fun things like this where you're creating patterns, but it's also very practically used for things like applying highlights, or in cases where maybe you wanted to make sure that something like snow was piling up on boughs on a tree. You could just mask that area off so that you can paint and get all of your fun reactions without having to worry about making sure that area stays white. And to remove the masking fluid, again, you need to make sure that everything is dry. And we don't want to force this dry. This just needs to dry on its own, but wait till everything is super duper dry before you do this because paper is more fragile when it's wet. So you're going to be at a bigger risk of ripping the paper. Also, masking fluid should most commonly be used with a watercolor type paper because if it's more of a sketchy type paper that can handle watercolor, it's pretty likely that it's going to rip it. Watercolor paper is pretty sturdy and can typically hold up to a lot of things. But when you do go to remove it, there are a couple different ways you can, and depending on the masking fluid you're using, you're going to find different ones work better for you. You can just take a clean, dry finger and rub gently in kind of circular motions. You could also use a clean rag to do the same thing, or they do have these mask away removers. And with my previous brand of masking fluid, this was the easiest way to get this off, but this one, it actually feels like it's a little bit easier with the towel, so I'm just going to go with that. And I recommend resisting the urge to just pull this up because that's when you're actually most likely to rip the paper. So I do really recommend just a gentle touch on this. And our final technique of this video is a gradient wash. And this is such a wonderful technique because it is infinitely applicable to different types of paintings, but it's also going to show you a little bit of water control and a little brush control, as well as just how your paints work a bit. So this is a good one to practice. What I want you to do is mix up two different colors. In this case, I'm going to be using a pink and a purple. And I also want to make sure that you mix up enough of these because we need to be able to refill our brush multiple times. Now there are a couple different ways to actually create a gradient wash, but my favorite is using what's called a drip line technique. And in this example, notice that I am holding my hand under the board, and this is going to actually place that board at an angle because I want to use gravity as my friend. Then I'm going to take my first color and I'm going to fill my brush up completely with it, and I'm going to make a stroke across the page. I want there, with me holding that at an angle, for there to be a line of drips basically across that first stroke. If there's not, just drop a little more color. I'm going to repeat that a few times where I refill my brush with that same color and then make a stroke directly underneath the previous one, pulling that drip line down, and I'm going to maintain that drip line so that each one is going to kind of create a smooth transition, because once I get to the point that I want to start transitioning to the next color, I'm going to take my brush, I'm not going to wash it, I'm just going to dip it into that second color. Then I'm going to make my line, pulling that down, and what we're doing is we're refilling the brush, and the brush still has some of the previous color, but we're refilling it with a new color, and so it's going to slowly kind of mix together in the bristles, making sure that we add a little at a time, continuing that drip line down until we get to the very bottom of the page, and by that time you'll have transitioned to the other color fully. You can also see here there are a couple different bands where the color did switch over a little more drastically, and that's because I wasn't super careful about how much of the new color I was adding. So keep in mind when you're practicing this one, it might take you a bit of time to actually make sure that you're really getting that nice smooth gradient, and it's going to be all about maintaining that drip line that's going to kind of help feed the next line down, and also making sure that you're slowly changing the color in your brush. And even though this technique is one of the more complicated ones to actually do, I highly recommend trying this, because my favorite thing to do with this is actually paint a really beautiful sunset gradient, and doing that is worth the effort of learning this technique.
It's hard for me to choose a favorite because they are all so cute and interesting in their own ways. I think I might send these out to my gal pals as a little Galentine's Day present because they are so cute and fun and colorful. I would love to know what your favorite of the techniques was and how you plan on using it. Maybe is it in a background or on a specific type of creature, or are you just going to use it for patterns?